Okay, so good afternoon. I'm Kelly Shannon, the director of the Peace, Justice, and Human Rights Initiative, and it is my great pleasure today to welcome you to the PJHR Faculty Affiliate Research Colloquium featuring Dr. Robin Vallacher. I'd also like to give a special thanks to Ji-Young Bae, who's PJHR's program coordinator and who helped to organize this event. And thank you all for coming this afternoon, and I really look forward to today's event. Our speaker is Dr. Robin Vallacher, interim chair and professor of psychology here at FAU. He is also a PJHR faculty affiliate and a member of our advisory committee. Dr. Vallacher is also a research associate in the Center for Complex Systems at the University of Warsaw in Poland and a research affiliate in the Advanced Consortium on Cooperation, Conflict, and Complexity at Columbia University. Dr. Vallacher has been a visiting scholar at the University of Texas at Austin, Claremont Graduate University, the University of Bern in Switzerland, the Max Planck Institute for Psychological Research in Munich, Germany, and the University of Montpellier, maybe, I don't know if I pronounced that correctly, in France. He has received funding for his research from the National Institute of Mental Health, the National Science Foundation, the Polish Science Foundation, the Max Planck Institute for Psychological Research, and the James S. McDonnell Foundation. Dr. Vallacher has authored or edited 9 professional books, authored a social psychology text, and written over 150 book chapters and journal articles. Woo! He has presented the results of his research at over 150 national and international conferences and has delivered addresses at over 20 universities in the United States and Europe. He and his colleagues at several universities in the US and Europe were among the first to adapt principles and methods from complexity science and dynamical systems to investigate a wide range of topics in personality and social psychology. Today, he is a widely recognized leader in the redirection of this field. His presentation today centers on his recent publication, Rapid Social Change and the Emergence of Populism, which appeared in the edited volume, The Psychology of Populism, The Tribal Challenge to Liberal Democracy, which was published by Routledge just last month. Dr. Vallacher's work is especially timely, and I know that we will have a fantastic conversation throughout his presentation and during the Q&A that will follow. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to you, Robin.
Okay, thanks very much, Kelly. I really appreciate that. I must say that the screen froze a couple times, and occasionally I get a sign saying my internet connection is unstable. Hopefully that'll resolve itself. We'll do what we can. As a way of preface for all this, I just want to point out that psychology as a field has changed a great deal from when I first started out. I don't want to say how many years ago, dog years ago, where psychology was just confined to laboratory experiments. There was a period where we used animal models to understand how the mind works, rats that press levers to get food pellets and so forth. Changed a great deal. And in fact, psychology has now got to the point where we're almost, the boundary conditions between us and sociology, political science, other social sciences is dissolving, which gives us a little more freedom. So I can talk about things, which I will today, that kind of trample on or invade other people's territories. But the field has changed in that regard. Another way the field is changing is the distinction between so-called basic research and applied research. It used to be we just kept our own little schoolyards. People in basic research didn't care too much about external validity except through speculation, whereas applied research got their hands dirty. We got in and solve real problems. That's dissolving as well, in part because of big data, which allows us to actually formulate theories and test hypotheses with real world data, but also because of other developments, including dynamical systems and computational modeling. So as a preface, just to sort of justify why I'm getting a territory that's not really traditional social psychology. Today, I do want to talk about populism. I think populism not only is it front and center in the news every day and around the world, but it also really captures a lot of the issues that are relevant to PJHR. I mean, it's racism, it's xenophobia, it's in-group, out-group relations, it's intolerance, it's narrow-mindedness, all these things that we're concerned with. And it's something that's universal. We see it. So I think it's a very important topic to really delve into. So with that, let me start sharing my screen. And I think I can do this. Okay. I'm sure I can do it. We did it before. It worked. Here we go. Whoops, that's not it. Sharing screen. Okay, here we go. Okay, you got that? You see my screen?
Yes.
You're seeing
Yeah.
the front page, right? The talk, right?
Yes.
Okay,
Perfect.
good. All right, so yeah, so the thing I want to get into today is why populism now is becoming such a hot issue, why it's emerging around the world. It's easy to trace it to some local conditions and so forth, but conditions differ around the world. But yet worldwide, there seems to be a lot of interest, a lot of trends that look like nationalism, populism, that are remarkably similar across different societies. Okay, so all right. Kelly mentioned the book from which this chapter is taken. My talk is based on that chapter. This book just came out. In fact, I haven't even received my copy of it yet. But these guys, Joe Forgas, Bill Crano, and Klaus Fiedler, are very high-power social psychologists. Every year they put out a different symposium dealing with a different topic in social psychology. This year they chose populism. So they asked me to write a chapter, and I did, as did about 18 other people. So I won't get into their chapters, but I'll certainly talk about mine. Okay, so the place to start is the most basic question. What is the basis for populism? Why do people get discontented, unhappy, and resort to very unsavory aspects of human nature, the darker side and so forth? Okay. That, I mean, the usual suspects include things like income and wealth inequality. Okay, we're upset about tax breaks for corporations and the wealthy. The minimum wage hasn't really increased, for 30 years if you control for inflation. Healthcare expenses are really high. College expenses are high. And around the world, you can find similar complaints about the inequality, the top 1% and so forth. Okay, so that's certainly a reasonable place to start. Okay, another suspect, another obvious place to look is more procedural nature. The idea here being that people are upset because they feel they don't have voice in what matters. What may look like a democracy may not really be that in practice. They feel things are controlled by the elites. If you really go crazy and go QAnon level stuff, it's lizard people, I guess, suck blood from babies or something. But within, if you don't have to go that far, to get the sense that people feel that the system is rigged. The elites control everything. Lower and middle class people are just taken for granted, or their voice, their interests are really being ignored. Okay. And a third suspect that's often mentioned is that people get upset about values and lifestyles. People have contempt for the rich and famous and the lifestyles they lead that sort of flout norms and religion and so forth. Also, the sense that there might be some intolerance about different religions, anti-Muslim sentiment and so forth. There might be disgust against about things like homosexuality and interracial marriage. These all make sense. People get, some people can get upset about that. But I want to make a little bit different case. Okay, I'm not sure that's really it. Okay, in fact, if you look at the history, people live with income inequality. In fact, in this country, people who really are most opposed to the liberals' economic agenda are, in fact, people who would benefit from it. You've all heard the phrase, "What's the matter with Kansas?" Right? That book came out a number of years ago, arguing that the cultural conservatives really are voting against their own self-interest in many respects. So it's not just income inequality per se that does that. We also know that subjective well-being, how happy people are, is only weakly correlated with income anyway. So people might live with meager means, at least maybe a lower middle class income, and their subjective well-being is tied to entirely different matters, how many friends they have and things like that. We also know that social comparison is local rather than global. We don't compare ourselves to, most people don't compare themselves to extremely rich people. They look around their neighborhood. So if they're doing as well as their neighbors, sure, maybe on a macro level, it's not too good, but they can live with that. So income inequality itself may not be the driving force. And finally, there's some research by John Jost at NYU, who's made this case over and over again about what he calls system justification. I'm not sure if you're familiar with this term or not, But the idea basically is that people live in a society, and the tendency is to sort of rationalize the way things are. Things are good the way they are. From an outsider's perspective, it might look horrible, unfair, and so forth. But even poor people, those who are disadvantaged in most societies, tend to find a way to justify the way things are and not protest too much. Okay, so the upshot here is that income inequality and things that look unfair may not be the driving force. It's also the case when it comes to voice, the other issue I mentioned, feeling like you're part of the process. Throughout history, oligarchies have been the rule. Democracies are the exception. The United States, when it was founded, was one of the very first democracies, right? So through most of human history, we've had, rules like caste systems, monarchies. And in fact, during times of stress and uncertainty, there's evidence that people tend to prefer authoritarian rule, just straighten things out and take care of things. So voice is not necessarily the issue, okay? So that raises the question, well, what is? If it's not income inequality, it's not voice, it's not feeling like you're represented as the driving force, what is the source of populism, okay? So I'm gonna make the point, and it's a fairly easy point to make, I think, but I wanna demonstrate it with some computer simulations, that societies, as long as they remain stable for long periods of time, there might be some underlying hostility. I'm not sure people, serfs in the Middle Ages, Dark Ages, were happy, but they lived with it. They may even justified it, as long as things are stable, okay? So in the Dark Ages in Europe, it lasted about 1,000 years, there was very little revolt. There may have been some that were squelched and so forth. They weren't necessarily happy, but it persisted. Autocratic regimes and monarchies in Asia and Europe have been there throughout history. Little evidence of mass uprising, okay? And the idea here is that stability provides coherence. When things are stable, the tendency is to sort of see that as the way it's supposed to be. It all makes sense. There's patterns, there's regularity, and people seek regularity and stability, okay? But when the equilibrium is disrupted by new events, the rapid introduction or conflict with new beliefs and lifestyles that everyone experiences, it's the disruption to equilibrium that really unleashes the underlying tensions, okay? So for example, in the United States, one could argue that one reason why there's some populist sentiment now is that things have changed, arguably for the better. I mean, if you look at the support for same-sex marriage, it was a minority as recently as, as recently as 1997, 35%. And in 2017, a few years later, it's up to 64%, which is a majority, okay? Same thing with interracial marriage. And if you can believe this or not, it's amazing, but in 1958, a very small minority of people were in support of interracial marriage, 4%. Now it's upwards towards 90%. It's not uncommon to see people with, people with different races getting together on TV and so forth, getting married, and people don't bat an eye, okay? But that's a rapid change, okay? Legalization of marijuana, I don't have the data on this, but that's just in the last 10, 15 years, been a dramatic change in people's attitudes towards marijuana use in most parts of the country. We used to put people in jail for 10, 15 years. I think they still do in Texas, I'm not sure about that. But for the most part, people are pretty cool with marijuana, okay? Rapid changes, okay? Another thing, of course, is immigration. For a variety of reasons, the world is experiencing lots of immigration, a move from one country to another, often driven by famine and hardship, but often just because search for a better life. So the mixing of different cultures and languages has occurred in a fairly short period of time, historically speaking, okay? And then most recently, we've experienced COVID-19, okay, this pandemic. That changed everything in a matter of months or weeks, beginning about a year ago, sometime in March. Suddenly the economy went into shutdown. We started wearing masks, no longer shake hands. We can't go out to restaurants, we can't go to movie theaters. Complete change in our social life and the economy, a very, very rapid change, okay? All these things have a way of destabilizing the way we normally conduct ourselves in our culture, okay? So this is a little bit strange I'm going to sort of dump on my own field of social psychology here for a minute. If you look at research on group dynamics, and I know quite a bit about that, one of the big generalizations from group dynamics theory and research is that change is not a problem. People accommodate change quite well. Okay. The argument is that when people, even from complete strangers, get together, there's a tendency to look for consensus and to agree upon some sort of higher order shared reality, norms and values and beliefs and so forth. Okay. Good examples of this, we know about conformity. You put strangers together in a situation where they're looking at ambiguous figures and so forth. In a short order, they all kind of agree what they're looking at. May not be correct, but they come to agreement. Everybody knows about groupthink. You put think tank people together, who are trying to solve some sort of dilemma in the world, and they quickly come to some sort of consensus of what's going on. Again, it may not be accurate. Groupthink is often held out. An example of groupthink that didn't go too well was the invasion of Cuba in the early 1960s in the Kennedy administration. But the point is, people tend to agree. Group polarization. You find groups that have some sort of feelings about, maybe it's in a criminal justice trial, jurors and so forth. After talking, they wind up convincing each other, and they tend to sort of agree on one point of view, which often is more polarized than they thought they'd have at the beginning. Emotional contagion. You put people who are complete strangers on the street and some event happens and rapidly start experiencing the same emotional reaction to it. De-individuation is another example. You go to Mardi Gras or Key West or something during Fantasy Fest, complete strangers, different walks of life, and they all start feeling the same energy and start feeling the same moods and so forth, for good or bad. Sometimes it's wonderful, they have fun. Other times it's not so great. Social identity, put people together and live together for a while, they start converging on a common set of values and beliefs. That's the impression you get from social psychology, is that people tend to, when change comes along, they kind of get on board with it and they influence each other to feel the same way. But that's true as long as the group is a relatively manageable size. Most of the research in social psychology showing this phenomenon are small groups, 10, 15, maybe 20 people. In the case of de-individuation, you may have a crowd of 100 people, on a crowded street in New Orleans or something, okay? This may be impossible, however, when you have large social systems. Again, something that social psychology traditionally has not really examined. That was left to the sociologist. So uniformity may not be so easy to attain in large systems for a few reasons. First of all, we know that human networks are very limited in size. Robin Dunbar, a number of years ago and even today, has made the case that people have at most maybe 100 acquaintances and maybe 20 close friends and 5 or 6 or 7 or 8 are really close. No matter how crowded the society is, how many opportunities there are, even with social networks, people limit their contacts to very few people. Larger than that of a chimpanzee, but not by much. We'd have very few, our networks are small, okay? It's also the case that social influence, such as conformity and so forth, is very local in nature. We tend to be more influenced by nearest neighbors, people who come in contact with and so forth. So in a large society of 300 million people, you're not gonna have the kind of contact. So social influence is very localized. The result of all this is that instead of having one coherent social reality for a country like, say, the United States or any other country, you wind up with different clusters, different social realities separated from one another, each one characterized by consensus and coherence, okay? So one thing that I think has been overlooked by social psychology over the years is a tendency for social systems to evolve into clusters rather than one single homogeneous reality, okay? And that, I think, is something we need to really be sensitive to. Okay, so one way to think about this is in terms of, in dynamical systems, what are called phase transitions. When a rapid change occurs, often, rather than just the whole system being changed, it takes place in parts. In other words, some parts of the system begin to change. That would be the new. And then the rest of the system remains where it was, the old. Classic case of a phase transition in physics is when you boil water. When you boil water, it doesn't suddenly burst into steam all at once. No, you have bubbles of gas, the steam, coexisting with the water for a period of time. You have the old and the new coexisting. If it goes on long enough, sure, everything will turn to steam, but that takes a while. So you turn up the heat, and you get a lot of bubbles going on that coexist with the water that's there. Okay. So the idea from, if you extend this idea from physics, when there's a rapid social change, you basically have bubbles percolating through the system that grow at the expense of the old, the sea of the old. Okay, so a little metaphor for that. Okay, and for some reason, okay, here we go. So that means when there's rapid social change, often the society is characterized by two distinct and very separate social realities. One example I came across is if you look at the history of computer technology in the United States, it didn't happen everywhere at once. You know, Silicon Valley, some places of Texas, maybe in the corridor line in around Boston and so forth, that coexisted with very old ways of mailing letters and so forth. And then over time, the new way of thinking gradually percolated through, and society as a whole became transformed. Okay. So when there's a rapid social change, there's often the coexistence of two separate realities. Okay. Speaking of technology, okay. So one way to, okay, all right. So one model of this, and this is something that goes back to 1990. Andrzej Nowak, my colleague who's from Poland, he was really prescient. He was really ahead of his time. He lived in Poland. He grew up there. So in the late 1980s, when the communist regime was falling apart and the Berlin Wall came down and so forth, he was working at the Center for Conflict Systems in the Institute for Social Studies. And they're one of the first people to collect massive big data about what happened during the transition. And he was a bright guy and ahead of his time, knew how to do cellular automata models, agent-based modeling, to try and model the transformation that was taking place in Poland. Okay, so let me just walk you through this very, very quickly. I won't go into too much detail. A cellular automata basically is almost like a checkerboard, where you have individual agents, each one of those squares modeled as a little square, and you have say two different attitudes. Let's take, for example, whether you should get vaccinated or not. Okay. Before COVID, you would mention something like vaccination against COVID. It might be a random distribution of feelings. People didn't really know what to think. Okay. Let's say the greens are people who say, yeah, vaccination sounds good. But the pinks are people who say, no, I don't trust vaccine. Okay. The height of the bar represents how strong these individuals are. This is a very important factor. We like to think that people are fairly equal in their influence. That's not the case. We know that social influence is very unequally distributed. Some people, for example, may have more knowledge regarding the issue in question. Maybe they're more charismatic and persuasive. They may have status. They may be dogmatic and strong-willed and force their opinions on others. They may have a greater sense of personal agency and competence and so forth. For whatever reason, people differ in their strength. That's all the model assumes. There's two different attitudes. By the way, this is very common and very important attitudes that tend to be binary in nature, pro and con. And people differ in how strong they are. And the model simply says, you take the starting configuration, which is random, but a slight favor, I think 60% green in favor of vaccination. You let the model run. And the model simply says that each element, each one of those squares, individuals, interacts with his or her neighbors. And the closer a neighbor is, the stronger the influence between them. So you take someone, this guy right here, the pink one, very influential on the nearest neighbors, but not so influential way over here. In fact, it's the square of the distance. So it's local influence, that's critical. Local influence, as we said, is very important in group dynamics. Strength is important. And then you say, well, if you just run this model where people are influenced by their nearest neighbors, strong people are more influential than weak people, and let that model run, what happens as a result? Does it stay random? Right, here's the formula, don't worry about this. Okay. You let the model run maybe 100 times until an equilibrium is reached. And what you wind up is something like this. It's no longer random. Okay. So when people talk to each other, clusters begin to form. Okay, so the pro-vaccine people tend to live in their own little world, and then you have a minority out here of people who are anti-vaxxers. Okay, they may be smaller number, but they're locally coherent. Okay, so that's what the model shows. He's run this thing with different types of attitudes, different types of strength variables, and so forth. You always find that what starts out as a random configuration becomes highly clustered over time. Okay, so when you do that, what that research shows is two what are called system level properties. One is polarization. And the idea, if you look at that graph, I can go back in real quickly, the 60% has now become 72%. In other words, if there's a slight bias in favor of an attitude, that attitude gains in popularity. In this case, from 60% to 72%. In fact, that's fairly similar to what happened with vaccine. People were kind of skeptical at first, but more people liked it than didn't. And over time, people are more and more with getting vaccinated against COVID. Okay. If you just looked at that, and often this is what public opinion polls do, they say, well, that's great. The mean is changing. There's a moving average in favor of, oh boy, everybody's going to be accepting of vaccines. Okay. But that's misleading because another factor is clustering. The minority has shrunk. Maybe it was 40% at the beginning. Now it's down to 28%. It looks like they're going away. Okay. But because they survive in clusters, that protects them from the majority influence. In other words, minorities become smaller, but more self-contained, and they can sort of protect each other from outside influence. Okay. So unless you take into account the clustering phenomenon and focus only on the moving average, you get a misleading portrait of what's currently going on. Okay. And note also that the people who survive in clusters are stronger than than are those in the majority. Why? Because they're more, if they're strong, they're resistant to influence. The bias that's sweeping through society takes all the weak people, and they agree with it. But those who had a minority point of view, who are strong, aren't influenced. They find each other, they influence each other, and you have a strong local minority out there. Okay. This takes different forms. I don't know how much we're going to go into detail on this, but in the simulations, you find there's different types of minority clusters. One is called leader and followers, where you have a strong person who maintains the opinions of weaker people, keeps them pink in a sense. You might have sort of a charismatic demagogue or a leader who can really convince his followers. Another type of configuration that pops up in these simulations is what's called a stronghold, where all the strong people get together, maybe members of Congress, the Republican Party or whatever, or Democratic Party, constantly reinforce each other, and they can't be convinced. And a third thing is what's called a wall. The strong people are on the outside to protect all the people on the inside. Maybe they're the filters against new information, and they keep the people on the inside who might otherwise be influenced from being influenced. Okay, so these different configurations of clusters appear. Okay, but the larger point is that when you have this tendency for polarization with minority strength, the size of the minority decreases, but their strength increases. Okay, that makes them very resilient. Okay, and creates a potential for things to change. So when you have a strong minority and things change, there's a bias that comes through society. They can mount a counter reaction and change society entirely. That's what minority influence is really all about. Okay, so for example, if there's some sort of something happens to make people dissatisfied, expectations were unrealistic and were not fulfilled and so forth, that change in bias can allow the minority to launch a counteroffensive. Okay. Classic example of this, and this is what Novak is famous for, and I think it's a great model, is what happened in Eastern Europe during the late 1980s when communism was beginning to fall apart and so forth. What you found is that there's a strong bias in favor of economic enterprise, of democracy, after all these years under communism and socialism. Okay, so the people in favor of free markets and so forth increased dramatically. And look like, wow, society's going to change forever. Poland and Romania and so forth will never go back to communism again. Look at the average; it's increased. 75, 80% of the people believed in that. Okay, what happened was, let me describe this in this article from a couple of years ago, is that, people had unrealistic expectations. Without these social safety net of communism, people suddenly who are otherwise be protected, taken care of, lost their jobs, they're on the street, alcoholism picked up. They were very unhappy. So those few people were strong and resisted the allure of democracy and capitalism, suddenly had a powerful voice. And they were able to change in the next election cycle, like 1990, 91, a movement towards communism. It reversed itself completely. Okay, so minority influence can, if a bias changes, things change in a society, can suddenly become very powerful. Okay, well, look at this country. I said before that interracial marriage is now widely accepted. People are okay with gay marriage, really welcome immigrants and so forth, but some don't. Okay, it's interesting, in the last 15, 20 years in this country, the amount of bigotry and violence towards members of different racial groups has actually increased. Well, how is that possible? We all like, interracial marriage. We're all cool about people from different backgrounds and so forth. Why is there more violence? Anti-immigration sentiment. Most recently in the news, you hear about anti-Asian sentiment. People beating Asians up. Why? It flies in the face of what looks like a trend towards greater tolerance. Homophobia, I don't know the stats on that, but I think that's also picked up a little bit too, despite the acceptance of gay marriage. Well, that's consistent with this idea that people who don't buy into the change are very strong, and they try and mount a counterattack. So it's not really an irony or a paradox that these things are increasing despite progress on certain social fronts. Okay, another example that we're facing right now is COVID. I think most people are on board with wearing face masks and so forth, but I'm telling you, if you go to some places right now, a friend of mine my daughter actually, who lives in California, went to Big Bear Lake, really nice area in Southern California, and there's some really, provincial people there. She'd wear a mask and go in a store and she'd be shamed. You're stupid for wearing a mask and so forth. They get really angry. In the name of personal freedom. There's people out there who didn't buy into what Fauci was saying or the need to do these things, and were more concerned about the notion of personal freedom, and very, very virulent. And you have to wonder if now that we're getting so near to the finish line, this type of minority sentiment is actually increasing. People want to go to baseball games, they want to go crowd surfing, they want to have parties and so forth. And you might expect even a greater dissent against wearing masks and social distancing, despite the overall tendency, people generally, to be on board with that. Okay. So the point here is that when you just focus on the moving average, things are changing in one direction. If they change quickly, that can be very misleading because it doesn't talk about the people who are left behind in the old. I'm talking, by the way, I do this. I talk very quickly. When I'm not in front of a live crowd, I'm just talking. So interrupt anytime you feel like. I'd be glad to, clarify things if you need that. Okay, so, all right. So I mentioned the idea of reversals of social change. This is a thing we published in 2019 about social change and the reversal of change. So you might have up in the upper left corner where most people are pink, because of something sweeps through society, like the need to wear a mask. A few people hold out, a few greens up there, right? Okay. No, I'm sorry, this is prior to COVID, and no one is really wearing masks and so forth. Who would do that? All of a sudden we hear about how bad COVID is and how easily it's spread. More people start wearing masks, and pretty soon, when you got down to D, almost everybody, the majority, is okay with wearing masks. But these people who don't, these clusters of people who are anti-vaxxers, look how strong they are. Okay, so if something changes, like people say, oh, it's hurting our economy, it's limiting our freedom, I can't see my grandkids, and the bias changes, suddenly that minority group becomes stronger, and over time they can overtake and go back to where we began. So never discount the power of a minority, no matter how small they are in number, because of their strength and their local coherence to change things if something in society argues for that change. Okay, so this kind of captured, by the way, what happened in Eastern Europe. I mentioned before. Okay, all right. So those are the computer simulations that we've done with this, just to show how it works. And we've mapped that onto different types of historical examples, Eastern Europe being one. And I think it work, we haven't done this yet, but I think it'd probably work with COVID as well. Okay, so then the question becomes, okay, that's fine, you know, minorities hang in there and they get strong, but who are these people? I think in order to make really predictions, we have to know who are the people who resist the new. When something sweeps through society, like, you know, interracial marriage and same-sex marriage and so forth, who are the holdouts? Can we make predictions about that? And here we get into dynamics again, okay? So the question is, why aren't seemingly positive changes embraced by everyone? Who are the populists? Okay, okay. And the basic idea here is that I think it really centers on social identity. A new idea represents threats to people who have a particular social identity that makes them very resistant to the change, okay? And that in turn, I think, and you know, we want to expand the list, but I think really comes down to two basic factors. Two basic factors that predict threat. One is geography and demography. Okay, we'll talk about that. And the other, and I don't want to get in trouble with this, but it's hard to talk about this topic without doing so, is political orientation. So these two factors are where you live, okay, and your politics predicts whether you're going to be in a minority when certain types of changes sweep through society. Okay, so geography. Okay, we do find, and this is just a fact, this is data, these are data, that the resistance to change is strongest in fairly rural regions. Okay, southern and Midwestern states. You look at the map of after elections and so forth, you find the big swath of the South and the Midwest is red, and on the cities along the East and West Coast, maybe along, you know, the Mississippi River and so forth, are blue. Okay, and in those areas, small towns, less influence from the outside, there's greater homogeneity. Their social identity is relatively narrow. They look alike, they go to the same churches, same customs, the language, their dialect, family structures, they're married, have several kids perhaps, even the cuisine preference, you know, is similar. So they have homogeneity, which means that makes them very open to things that would threaten that, okay? Often hear the phrase of the people who supported a former president, make America great again. They want to go back to the old way where they had, you know, corner drugstores and people looked alike and they could leave their screen doors open and they had the same food and so forth. What they're really arguing for is the changes come and they're experiencing things from the outside that make them uncomfortable, okay? In urban areas, on the other hand, there's greater acceptance of change for the most part. They think of coastal cities in the East and West, urban areas in the South Midwest, okay? There's greater diversity in social identity, okay? You live next to people who look different than you, maybe go to different, have different religions. In New York City, you go a few blocks away and hear different languages, different lifestyles, even different cuisines and so forth. So the diversity there makes people a little more tolerant of things that represent rapid change, okay? Immigration being a great example of this. As you probably are well aware, immigration has been a very important trigger for populist sentiment around the world, in Europe, to some extent in the United States, okay?
Robin?
Yeah.
I'm really enjoying this, and I've got a number of half-baked questions, and I'm going to share one with you. On this very slide, it seems like the likelihood of change, each time you meet a new person, the likelihood of change increases if we take your initial model, right? There's an opportunity for change with exposure to additional people. And so the association between traditionalism and being rural as opposed to being urban, I'm wondering, does homogeneity contribute to anything over and above that? Or can we expect these differences in tradition simply as a function of population density?
Yeah, I'm going to get to that a little bit. I understand your point. I'm going to come at it a little bit differently later on when we talk about one reason I'm optimistic, for example, is precisely that point, because the contact we have is not quite as sealed off as it used to be. And it is possible. And you're right. When you meet someone new from a homogeneous region, the likelihood they're going to be different is greater than if you're from an urban region. You're already exposed to that type of difference. Okay. But that's a good point. I want to come back to that in a few minutes. But first, I'm going to make a more pessimistic point. Okay. So that's demography and geography. Political orientation. A lot of you are probably aware. A lot of research these days on what distinguishes a liberal from a conservative. Okay. So, for example, Jonathan Haidt, you're probably aware of him, has made a big deal about the moral foundations underlying political attitudes. Okay. One of the big points that he makes is that conservatives are much more consistent with regard to their moral foundations, which sounds kind of good. You know, if you have a moral foundation about what's pure and sacred, it sounds better than being kind of wishy-washy, right? But he finds that over and over again that conservatives tend to be much more consistent, much more narrowly defined in terms of what they consider moral. Okay, that suggests that conservatives have better values or clearer values. And he makes that point. You can make the case conservatives, rather than disparage them, we should just understand that they just have a very clear-eyed view of the world and they have clearer values. Okay, but there's another interpretation of Haidt, which I think is very important. It's just, I think it could be the case that rather than just saying they're more consistent, it's just they're less sensitive to situational constraints and forces. Okay, so conservative, these are some of the moral foundations that Haidt talks about. Respect for authority. Well, we had to have that in our evolutionary past and our cultural history. If you didn't have respect for authority, the whole thing would fall apart. We have to have in-group loyalty. What could be wrong with rooting for your sports team? Unless you're a Gonzaga fan, then all things falls apart after last night. Things didn't work out too well for them. But you love your country, America, right or wrong, and so forth. Purity and sanctity, that sounds very important. But if you just really, really follow those moral mandates, moral foundations, there's very few exceptions. It's very rigid. Okay. Liberals, on the other hand, they endorse these values as well, but they're much more sensitive to unequal opportunities that people have, the constraints on people's behavior and so forth. And they emphasize instead the power of the immediate situation. They can override just using these moral mandates. Okay, so, it's a question of how you want to phrase this. If you want to support the conservative way of thinking, you say, well, we have clear values. If you're a liberal, you say, yeah, that overlooks reality. It's not a level playing field and so forth. Okay, so the evidence here is very interesting. Haidt's own work in talking about moral foundations has found the only moral foundation that favors liberals is one about doing no harm and taking care of people who have been harmed. There, liberals shine. They really say, no, this is a very sacred value. We have to hang on to that. And conservatives are less likely to. Conservatives will say, no, we have to have respect for authority. And liberals say, well, not if they tell you to do bad things. Think about Milgram, right? So the evidence suggests that the only case in which liberals are more have a greater sensitivity to moral foundations when it comes to people getting hurt. They're bleeding hearts, right? Okay. Also, there's research showing that political conservatives tend to believe in a just world. Sounds ironic. You think about justice warriors being liberals. Turns out the most people who believe most strongly in justice of a certain kind are conservatives, because for them, justice means the world is already just. People get what they deserve and deserve what they get, i.e., if someone's suffering, they must have done something to bring that on themselves. Okay, that's why conservatives find it easier to live with people who live in poverty than liberals do. Because, well, maybe additional constraints and say it's not a level playing field and so forth. Okay, so all this suggests that political conservatives have a much more narrow range of thinking about things. Okay, which means by definition, if you have a narrow view of things, any outside difference is likely to be seen as threatening. Okay, you hear how that works, right? Okay, so one way to think about this is to go back to what are called attractors in dynamical systems. Maybe you're familiar with this idea. An attractor is like an equilibrium state. That is, there's attractors for the way people walk. You can tell what a person's attractor is for walking by looking at how they walk down the street. People have different ways of walking. You push a person off to the side, tell them to walk differently. They can do that for a minute or two, but pretty soon they're back to their standard way of talking. That's their attractor. We have that for our attitudes and beliefs. So you may have a very attitude about, what it's like to live in the mountains. And then someone introduced you to going to the beach one day, and that sounds really great, but pretty soon you start thinking about, no, I'd rather be in the mountains. Okay, so mental states have attractors, our actions have attractors, and the idea here is that applies to societal norms as well. So when there's an attractor or a dynamic equilibrium for how we think and behave, we resist change. Okay, if we're disrupted, it tends to be temporary, and we go back to our standard or pattern of behavior. Okay. So someone, for example, who is an extrovert and they try and be quiet at a party can do it for a few minutes, and next thing you know, they start talking again. Okay, so this idea of an attractor really is a very broad notion that captures things from patterns of behavior, attitudes, beliefs. It's a very foundational way of thinking about habitual ways of thinking and behaving. Okay. So we have defense mechanisms and mental systems. If you have high self-esteem and someone points out you just failed at something, that's only temporary. You feel bad for a minute, but then pretty soon you're back to recovering your old way of thinking. Okay. In our action systems, it's very hard to change habits. If you're trying to stop eating snacks at midnight and so forth, you might do it for a day or two, but pretty soon you're back to the fridge, right? Okay. If you have a bad tennis swing, for example, you try and correct the swing, but over time you go back to your old way of swinging the tennis racket. Okay. Well, we say that's true in cultural systems as well. Okay. So we have, for example, a strong attractor for what's good and bad behavior, what's moral, and so forth. And we hear things that counter that. We don't like it. We're intolerant. We reject the deviants. Okay. We get antagonistic towards those who think differently, towards outgroups. Okay. That's the basis of warfare. Okay. So, in other words, if you look upon the norms and values of society of corresponding to an attractor in a dynamical system, it kind of predicts these types of resistance to change. Okay. Now, here's where it gets a little tricky. So far, what I've said just sounds, well, okay, that makes sense. But one thing that's critical on why attractors are useful for thinking about this, attractors have two basic properties. You see this little diagram here. You can look upon this as a landscape with two gravity wells, A and B. A is fairly shallow, B is fairly deep, but they also differ in how wide they are. So the landscape, the basins, the boundaries of A are wider than a B. Okay, so the idea here is that, that on the one hand you can have depth, which that tells you how strong your attractor is. So a person with an attitude or a value that corresponds to B, they're really way deep in the gravity well. It takes a lot of energy to get you out of there. That black circle at the top, by the way, is your current state. And over time, it's going to roll one direction or the other. If it rolls into B, you're really stuck. That's really going to be hard to dislodge you because you're really, really way down in that valley. If you roll into A, it's hard to get you out of there as well, but it takes a little bit less influence to get you out. So knowing how strong people's attitudes and values are, or groups is, it's very important. Okay, so the depth or the strength of an attractor tells you how much you believe in the righteousness and the correctness of your point of view, your shared reality. But the other factor I think is more important, and this is overlooked routinely in public opinion polls and also in psychological analyses. That's the width dimension, or what we call the basin of attraction. Okay, that basically says how many new ideas you can incorporate and assimilate to the attractor. So in this case, B, it's a very strong attractor, but it doesn't incorporate or assimilate any new information. A, being a wider attractor, can encompass, can embrace, and accommodate or assimilate new information. Okay. So in both cases, if you're outside the attractor, it threatens your coherence and you reject it. Okay. But because these attractors differ in both dimensions, strength and width, I think it has implications going back to geography and political orientation. You probably see where I'm going with this, right? So we know this from research in other areas in physics and so forth, that these are two basic properties of attractors, not just the depth or the strength, but how broad how much they can accommodate new information. Okay, so you think about social and cultural systems. We mentioned the rural regions, for example. Pull this over to the side here, but we mentioned before that the identities, social identity in a rural region is more homogeneous. That means there's a fairly narrow basin for attraction. So someone in a slightly different cuisine, perhaps, or lifestyle, or religion and so forth, might be looked askance and seen as somehow threatening to the social identity. Okay. Okay. True for political conservatives. They see things in terms of moralistic terms. You do not disrespect authority no matter what. So someone who comes along and challenges authority and so forth, that might be seen as a deviant. A liberal has a wider range of values that can accommodate. So someone who questions authority, they might not get the same reaction. By the way, in psychology, this is a very reminiscent of a very old notion that never gets cited anymore, but I think it was brilliant, by Sharif and Hovland way back in the early 60s, called latitudes of acceptance and rejection. If you're not familiar with that, don't worry about right now, but the idea is that when you have an attitude, you can have a wide latitude, accept things that kind of conflict with it, not be bothered by it, or you can have very narrow latitude and be very rejective, and it's slightly discrepant. We know, for example, in research on what's called threat and egotism, people are very insecure about how good they really are, can't tolerate any criticism, they can't even laugh at themselves. I'm not going to mention any political figures here, by the way. Okay, so let that go. Okay, so examples. Two people can be equally religious, having very strong conviction about how important God is, and they believe in, biblical texts and so forth. But one person may just have a very narrow latitude or narrow basin. And if you tell them that the Earth is more than 10,000 years old, you're a deviant. Someone else will say, okay, I can accommodate the fact that the Earth has been around for maybe millions of years. I still believe in God. It doesn't bother me. Same thing with evolution. If you're a creationist, if you have a real strong view that the Bible is concretely accurate and so forth, evolution is a real threat. How can we evolve from different animals? How could it take 4 million years and so forth? Free will is another example. Some people believe that you can't have, you can't hold people responsible if they don't have free will. So if you say anything about determinism and we're the product of our environment, our biology and so forth, you're rejected. Other people say, no, come on, there's certain constraints. We're not always have free will and so forth. By the way, and I want to point this out, it's not just, we're talking about other people. It's true in psychology. Anybody who knows and I'm sure Kevin does because he's a psychologist, the early years in psychology is very balkanized, tribalistic. There were the behaviorists, the Gestalt people perhaps, the psychodynamic people, and they just didn't like each other. They just rejected each other entirely. Very narrow basins of attraction. If you're a rat psychologist, the idea that people had unconscious motives and so forth, that's heresy. You don't want to hear that, and vice versa. And today, most academics, no matter how strong they feel about their own particular theories, have a much wider basis. They can accommodate a variety of different ideas. So I just want to make that point because we think that academics are somehow above the fray, but we're just as prone to these sorts of issues as anybody else. Okay. So that's the basic idea that I think what's critical here is the basin of attraction that people have that dictates how tolerant they're going to be of rapid social change. Rural regions have a narrow basin, political conservatives might, and that makes them a little more reactionary towards things that upset their way of thinking. Okay, so it's not how strongly they hold the value, but how wide their basin of attraction is. So with that, here's the fun part. I want to speculate a little bit and go back to Kevin's earlier point. What does the future hold? If we know this, if we look upon society as a dynamical system with basins of attraction that predicts how we respond to rapid change, what's life going to be like as we go forward? Okay. Well, one scenario is very pessimistic. Very pessimistic. Okay. We know the rapid social change is all around us today. Technology. Look at how technology has changed the last 15, 20 years with the internet and GPS and self-driving cars and chips and artificial intelligence. Things are rapidly changing. Well, that could upset our equilibrium. Family structures change. Gone are the days where it's father knows best. You know, you had your wife and you had 3 kids, you know, 4 kids or whatever. People live together without getting married. They have kids out of marriage. They may not have kids at all, and so forth. People of the same sex can get married. That's very rapid change. We see a lot of rapid change in how much diversity there is in our religions and our ideologies. You know, our country is founded on pluralism, right? We don't always live up to it, but the change has been dramatic. You may, in the same town, have people who, you know, are Jewish and Muslim or Hindu and so forth, or not religious at all, and we don't live in a homogeneous society anymore. Okay, so that makes us, if that's the case, that rapid change upsets our equilibrium and produces things like anger and resentment and populism, that's pessimistic. This is reinforced by social media. That's our one interesting thing that's happened in the last 15, 20 years, because in social media, you produce what are called echo chambers. It used to be when you lived in a city, you know, or even a small town, you walk down the street, as Kevin pointed out, you might see someone new who has a slightly different point of view. Well, we don't have to do that anymore. Just go to the internet and defriend people, screen people, select only people who already agree with you, and you get this incestuous positive feedback loop that we know will just polarize opinions. So if you're in one social media outlet, you're totally divorced from anybody else, others who have a different social media echo chamber, okay? That would tend to increase the degree of clustering we have in separate realities, right? So you have positive feedback within the minority clusters. That, of course, promotes, as we know from polarization research, even stronger attitudes, a deeper attractor, okay? And the lack of contradictory information helps reinforces the narrow basis of attraction. You don't have to hear contrary points of view. You know, if you hear if someone has a different point of view, you don't have to listen to them. We used to all listen back in the day, back in the 1960s, listen to Walter Cronkite on TV, and we'd all get the same information. Now some people listen to Fox, to MSNBC. Each one of those has its own kind of incestuous little positive feedback, which reinforces just one point of view. Okay, so that's kind of pessimistic. How are we going to respond to change and diversity if we're getting narrower and narrower in our basins of attraction? Okay, so if we do encounter counter information, it's not assimilated to the attractor, but it's fake news. By the way, this is something I want to get into right now, but I think it's interesting, is the role of demagogues in all this. I think it's pretty straightforward, but demagogues throughout history have been very good at discounting other sources of information because they know you might come across it. If you discount at the outset as fake news, it doesn't matter if you're here, you just don't believe it. So CNN's fake news, no matter what they tell you about, you know, how many people died of COVID, it's simply not true, okay? So, you know, in other words, because of social media and in combination with rapid change, we have separate clusters of very different shared realities. People can't talk to each other. You can't have Thanksgiving dinners together. Well, for one thing, because of COVID, but you bring Uncle Ned over from the old neighborhood and a fight breaks out, right? Okay, so this amplifies the natural tendency we have towards favor our own in-group, and you create clusters. All very pessimistic. Is there an optimistic way of thinking about this? Okay, first of all, the worst case scenario, this could be, and people are even talking these days about possible civil war in this country. I don't know. There's conflict galore and people can't talk to each other. All very pessimistic. But, oh, and here's some evidence for it, by the way. Here's some Pew survey data from recent years, looking at the tendency for people who are liberal, who are Democrats and Republicans, to agree or disagree on different attitudes. Back in 1994, the Venn diagram was pretty strong. That big dark area in the middle here where people would cross over and they would adopt a different point of view than they would normally hold. That started separated in 2004. By 2017, you have almost two different tribes out here. Liberals only, Democrats only adopted liberal points of view. Republicans only adopted conservative points of view. It's for all the reasons we just mentioned. Okay, that sounds very pessimistic. The optimistic point of view is one that I think we can offer as well. Again, the critical factor here is the basin of attraction. How wide is our net that we capture new information with without being threatened? Okay. Will these basins increase in width? And I think they might. And one of the ironies here is that because of the rapid change of technology, it's undermined some of the things that produce narrow basins. For example, you could be living in Mississippi and have a very homogeneous view of the way the world should work and so forth, but you have access to the internet. You see movies, television. You may select which TV shows you watch, but you might encounter some that provide different ways of thinking. Social mobility. You take road trips, air travel. You live in Mississippi, you take a trip to Europe, or someplace else. With that type of exposure, is safe. You might encounter different lifestyles, ethnicities, languages, and so forth without feeling threatened by it. It used to be if one country encountered another country is to try and take it over. There's a war or something. They wanted the resources. But now you can do it just as a visitor and sort of learn how the French, eat their food and so forth, and learn different customs and appreciate different lifestyles that allows you to sort of broaden your basin of attraction. And to the extent that people from rural regions are likely to do that, that could be effective as well. Okay. So in other words, contact with different groups. These days, you could argue is based less on conflict, increasingly on choice. We do it because we want to do it, not because we feel threatened. Okay. So that's very positive. Okay. That's what I have for positivity. Okay. However, even there, I hate to end on a sour note, but even there, if you believe the optimistic scenario, that we're widening our basins of attraction because of exposure and internet, movies, and so forth, even there's a very important caveat. Okay. Caveat is this. The optimistic scenario does not guarantee we'll eliminate any problems. In fact, with a wider basin, you become very open to change. But what if the changes are not so wonderful? What if inequality increases and you're exposed to that? It could be that with these wide basins, you accept any change, even those that aren't so wonderful. So you could have greater acceptance of inequality if that becomes something you're exposed to a great deal. So, you got to be careful what you wish for. We should have wider basins of attraction, be open to new ideas and so forth. But if the issue is really change, not content, okay? And if you can accommodate change, you can live with any content. Maybe that's why, what's the matter with Kansas holds, because they're able to live with things that that would otherwise be upsetting. So, in other words, the future could be both very complacent, we get along quite well, but by today's standards, very unfair. Which is why we still need, no matter what happens, no matter how much contact we have to be very, very sensitive to the things that our initiative is dealing with. Peace, justice, and human rights, a never-ending struggle. Okay, that's it.
Okay, great. Thank you, Robin. That gives us a lot to think about. And I want to say I appreciate how clearly you explained all of this, even to somebody in the humanities. I fully followed what you were saying. I think your students are very fortunate to have a professor who's able to explain things as clearly as you do. I'm sure that our audience has questions. I know we lost a few people around 4 o'clock, but we do have a good group here still. So I think probably the easiest thing to do would just be to open the floor. If you have a question, feel free to raise your hand or just type in the chat you have a question, and then we'll call on you and unmute yourself and ask your question, and hopefully we can have a good conversation. So does anyone have any questions for Robin?
Hey, Robin, thanks for giving the talk. One area I'm interested in is because we've been studying this type of work in our CES lab with Dr. Polsky, and focusing on behavioral economics with Kahneman and Tversky and some of the folks of Slovic in the 70s and 80s, and applying that to natural hazard risk. But one of my big questions that we haven't really touched on yet is how to apply this type of knowledge into communication moving forward, especially as it relates to climate change or flood risk or any type of risk. Basically, knowing what we know so far about how people perceive and understand information based upon their cultural identity or their psychology or other factors, are there recommended or optimal ways to communicate to each a different group? So for climate change group, maybe going directly with the science is not the best thing to do. For those who deny the science, I guess what's the better marketing approach to get through to that group?
Okay, on climate change, that's a very specific, and I'll broaden the scope to another more general answer. On climate change, some very interesting research has developed on that, how you communicate to people who are climate skeptics. What you do, you can frame the message in two different ways. Climate change, we're all going to be underwater in Miami. We have to do something that's really, really horrible. All it does is make people defensive, because that really threatens their way of thinking and so forth. The more effective strategy with climate change is to point out positive things that could happen if we do things. In other words, you emphasize the promotion versus the prevention aspects. So if you emphasize, by the way, we might have a stronger economy if we do this. We're not going to lose jobs or gain jobs. So frame it in a positive sense. That has nothing to do with dynamics and what I've been talking about per se, but I was kind of struck by that. It's very effective. I've done this research with people who are climate skeptics, and they find out that it's very effective. Just frame it in terms of positive terms. Another idea, which is more dynamic in nature, comes out of the research I've done for years on deconstruction. Okay. If you have a very strong attitude, it operates like an attractor. You keep going back to a way of thinking and so forth. It's very difficult to change that. You get defensiveness. What you can do is bypass entirely that higher order state, the conclusion, and go to some of the details, deconstruct it into its components. We know that in dynamical systems, the deconstruction of a system into lower level elements enables the potential for self-organization into a new state. We think the mind works the same way. If you can disassemble a person's thinking into lower level features and so forth, each one of which they can't argue with, then they might be in a position to be led to a new way of reassembling their thoughts into a higher order value and so forth. We haven't done that with climate change yet. We have done that with self-esteem. Some self-concept research we've done, we take people who have low self-esteem, for example, and point out little things they do well, tiny things and so forth. They can't argue with that. And then they're left fragmented, all those little pieces. The mind wants to have coherence and wants to put it back together again. You can guide them to a new framing of those elements to create a new whole. So that's one approach, is just to use the idea of trying to not attack the coherent state that defines the attractor itself, but rather fragment it, deconstruct it, and then rebuild it from scratch.
Yeah, I imagine that process could be very difficult and lengthy for some. If you're talking about deconstructing a previous worldview and reconstructing a new.
It's very difficult. In fact, one way you have to do it is try and, I hate to say be dishonest or deceptive, but make them think you're not really doing that. It's almost like a con. You sort of take it outside the attraction. You're talking about something entirely different, and then you point out little things that really don't tap directly into their higher order state. And the potential for creating this alternative latent attractor on the outside, it's always there that they could move towards in the future. We do this with conflict resolution. We find in the Mideast, for example, people who are negotiating, trying to end the conflict, you don't tell the other side that they're wrong. You talk about the table they're sitting at. You talk about seating arrangements, what kind of food we're going to have, and so forth. Get little agreements here and there and so forth, sidestepping the issue entirely. And then in that way, maybe create some sort of positive state that they could learn to see each other in if conditions ever change. They have some place to go to see each other. So when I did my work at Columbia with Peter Coleman and others at the Center for Conflict Resolution, we talked about that strategy. You go into areas that are war torn with civil wars and so forth, and do this deconstruction strategy, try and rebuild the way that people think in ways without challenging them directly. Again, you're absolutely right. It's difficult, not always successful. And if you're interested, let me know. I'd be glad to send you a couple articles on this, how it has been successful.
Sounds good. Thank you.
Sure.
Great. Do we have other questions? Maybe while the audience is pondering, I have a question that I'm trying to fully form here. So, my historian's brain is taking the information that you presented and saying, well, this does apply to a lot of historical situations and a lot of historical movements around the world. And as somebody who believes in peace, justice, and human rights, a lot of these historical movements have tended more towards the dark side, and they've gone against human rights. And you can think of the rise of Nazi Germany. You can think of the rise of the Islamic Republic in Iran. Some current day movements in the United States and the Philippines and parts of Latin America. So I'm curious if populism can ever go in the other direction, where it could lead people toward pushing for more social justice. And the one example that pops into my mind, and this is not something that I researched, so it's just sort of a loose example, is the populist movement in the US in the late 19th century that was responding to some really serious problems caused by industrialization. And eventually it got subsumed by the broader reform movement of the progressive era. But people were really talking about the mistreatment of workers and the degradation of the environment. And they were coalescing under a movement that they term themselves as populist with a capital P. And historians in the main tend to see that particular movement as more positive, moving towards justice than some other ones. And it's just not to say that it didn't have some dark sides of its own, but I'm just kind of curious have you encountered the development of populism examples where perhaps it could push people toward making the world a better place for peace, justice, and human rights versus
I think it's a
going in the
very,
other
very good
direction.
point. The way I present it so far is, because I want to do an irony of this. Things get better and better, you have to watch out because of the reaction against that and so forth. But it could work just the other way as well. As things get darker and worse, you say, oh my God, society's really going to hell and these bad things are happening. The same dynamic works. The people who aren't convinced by that, who want to hang on to a nice way of viewing one another and have peace and so forth, that could also have minority influence and change and reverse the trend. So it's content free. It's a dynamic. It's not the whether it's moving towards good or moving towards bad. It could be either direction, but in either case, you get the opposite opponent process developing. And that's actually maybe, I don't want to argue this is a good way to think about it, but you could argue that when things really deteriorate badly, that could be a case for optimism, because some people will hang on to a very positive point of view that could have a resurgence. I'm not sure I'd recommend that as a strategy.
Right. Yeah. You don't want it to get to that point.
Right.
Thank you. Okay. So does anybody else have questions? Okay, Ryan has to leave. Thanks for coming, Ryan. I'll ask another one then. So
Sure.
in terms of thinking about how to enact positive change and maintain positive change, how do you think people in the group who supports expanded rights and expanded equality and all of the rapid changes that have occurred that you've talked about in your lecture, how do they deal with trying to talk to the other side? I mean, you talked about breaking down a person's mentality and rebuild it and find small pieces of common ground. But how do you do that when there are those strong thought leaders within that minority group who are also, consistently sending the opposite message of what the outsider wants to portray, right? So if somebody is fighting for racial justice and they're talking to somebody who maybe is open to that, but then they're also getting all of these messages from their echo chamber that go against that conversation. How is the scholarship or the research on this suggests that these conversations take place, given that there are these other influences?
I think that's the devil's in the details of this. We have yet to really figure that out. I can tell you one thing we have done at Columbia. We have this program, this attractor software program, where people think they're playing almost like a video game, but they're totally opposite sides. They're maybe one side of the Palestinian issue and so forth, a very, very entrenched issue and so forth. And what they have is they force us indicate as a piece of information comes up, is this going to have a short-term or long-term effect? Okay. And then they play. And when that happens, they start digging these attractors. And pretty soon the goal becomes trying to build the same attractor. And they wind up, even though from opposite points of view, they both get satisfied because they're creating the same attractor. They get on board because they're all progressing towards the same sort of what looks like just a game goal, and they come away from that a little more agreeable than they were before. We use this at West Point, for example, in training and negotiation. Peter Coleman did this a couple of years ago. If you're interested, I'll be glad this article is published in Negotiation Journal. I'll be glad to send it to you.
I'd love that.
Yeah. They use it, for example, in one of the countries that's oil rich. They had a lot of protests about the oil companies there and so forth. And there's riots and so forth, and how to get both sides to sort of agree on how to resolve things. They use this tool of negotiation, where the goal becomes trying to build a common attractor. They don't see that as threatening. This is almost like a game. They try to outsmart each other, in fact, who can do it better and so forth. But they wind up doing that in a way that pretty soon they come away changed as a result. Beyond that, you ask a very good question. How do you translate all this into practice? It's not obvious, and probably idiosyncratic, depending upon the conflict and the situation and so forth. And I think so. One reason why I wanted to mention this is something that historians who know more about history than I do, obviously, may come up with ways of thinking how this can be used more effectively to really bring about change. The purpose of our group is to bring about change, but as I pointed out at the beginning, more and more basic research and applied research are not so distinct. The stuff I'm doing now, I wouldn't have done 10 years ago. But more and more I see there's a direct link between how we think and how we theorize about things and how we actually put them into practice. Lewin said that, right? Nothing so practical is a good theory, right? But again, it's not trivial. I don't mean to be too flip about that. There has to be ways we have to think about how to actually put these things into practice.
Yeah. Exactly. Well, thank you. Okay, Glenn or Richard, do you have any questions for our speaker before we wrap up?
Sure, I guess I'll ask a question. Hi, I'm Richard. So, when you were talking about the psychology of authority there at that point, you were using the example of the conservative versus liberal dichotomy. Something that immediately came to mind was, of course, the January 6th event with a decidedly uncharacteristic, spurn of authority by the traditionally authority-happy conservative groups, mm-hmm. And it made me think of the model, right, of the attractors and the sort of stable state. As I'm more of an ecologist, really, and that's an ecology-minded person, and so I recognize that kind of modeling. And it just it made me think: is there a little bit like more elasticity to that? Like, is it easier to go uphill, so to speak, from an attractor? Obviously, the context matters, right? And there's caveats, heaps of caveats for all of these models and that we're applying to these social phenomena. But my question is that, do these kinds of phenomena show that perhaps maybe it's a little bit more. I don't know what I'm trying to say, but that it just sort of kind of like you can explain it into the framework that you were positing by saying that Trump was the authority that the only authority they recognized, which of course is the whole reasoning for it. But it also just seems inherently sort of to trump the model for lack of a better word. So I just was wondering if you might speak more on that and talk more about the attractor sort of.
I think you raise an interesting point, Richard. In fact, if you look at what's happened the last 10, 15 years, no one would have predicted where Republicans and conservatives stand on certain issues. They used to hate the Russians. No, Russians are, I'd rather be a Russian than a Democrat. You see t-shirts like that, right? So the content is very fungible. It changes a great deal. And so what a good, and I didn't talk about this in the talk too much, but in the chapter I do, what a demagogue does is reorient people to think about what is the right attractive state to have. So if you're a good demagogue and so forth, undermine the media, undermine the deep state. That's not really America. They're really kind of lizard people in disguise or something. And instead you invert the normal way of thinking, my country right or wrong, which is the 60s, anti-hippie stuff, no matter what the government did, it was perfectly right. Now it's almost the opposite. Okay, because what you've changed what the frame of reference is, what the attractor is. So a good demagogue really absorbs all the information, all the influence, all the values onto him or herself, usually a him, and anything else that would otherwise have seen antithetical becomes acceptable. I think you're right. So I think it'd be interesting to take a look at the January 6th situation, and you see the revisionism already going on in that. At first they try to say, well, it wasn't us, it was Antifa. That didn't work. And then you had a couple guys come out and say, well, there weren't guns, it really wasn't violent. And then you had even Trump come out and say, well, no, they were kissing cops, it really wasn't that bad and so forth. But they didn't have to go there. All they had to do was say, no, these are people who are enemies of the people, and you really are making America great again, ironically, by attacking Congress. It's a hard sell, and I suspect it doesn't work for most people, but people who are really dug into this sort of cult of personality, it seems to be effective.
Well, yeah, and thank you for talking more about it. I mean, all models are just tools, and all,
right.
And always kind of will have inherent, failings and bias. So it's not that the model is flawed per se, just that the system is very complicated, right?
It's very complicated. So one of the interesting ideas here, and again, you can quibble with this one too, is that to model things, you don't try and model things in their complexity. You want complexity to be emergent. You want to have a minimalist approach, as few rules as possible. You notice in that simulation that was presented, just two basic rules. You're influenced by people you're standing close to, and you're different in your strength. And that produces a lot of complexity, social structure and so forth. Now, it may not work and you find examples of that. Okay, then you tweak the model and you add new models in. It's a progressive refinement of a very minimalist model, adding only complexity when you really need to accommodate the new information, the new things that don't seem to fit. And that's sort of the logic, the sort of philosophy of science that goes into agent-based modeling. And you start simple and let complexity, to the extent possible, just be emergent rather than built into the model itself.
Thank you. I really like that point.
Thanks, Richard.
Thank you. Okay, so we have 5 minutes left. Glenn, do you happen to have a question? No. Okay.
None that come to mind.
Okay, great. Thank you. I mean, there's so much more that I think we can talk about, like which kind of people are drawn to that cult of personality. And I mean, there's a million more things. So hopefully we can continue this conversation in the future. But I want to thank Dr. Vallacher for presenting this fascinating piece of research and certainly very timely subject for us. And thank you, Richard and Glenn, for coming. And thank you to everyone else who came but has had to leave. If you're interested, we are recording this. And so hopefully the recording will go up on the website for PJHR after this is over. But thank you. And Robin, I don't know if you want to end with any final statements.
I want to thank you as well. And I just want to emphasize, I'm the chair now, I've got a lot of stuff to do, but I really want to hang on to this initiative. I think there's really a lot of added value here. And I'd like to see it develop in ways that are maybe kind of emergent. I'm not sure how it's going to develop. But I see a lot of potential here for outreach, to bring together people with different perspectives, having some sort of maybe a tentative roadmap, not a real clear roadmap, because we have to see where it goes. Collaboration with other schools, cross-disciplinary within FAU and so forth. And I think that it's extremely timely. I really support it.
Thank you, Robin. And look forward to having those conversations with you through the advisory committee and through your participation
Absolutely.
in PJHR. I'm always open to where, the ideas for our community within PJHR, the ideas that you have for where you would like to see us go. And, we certainly have plans for growth and to try to build those cross-college, cross-disciplinary, okay, it's been a long day, bonds, and then also create relationships with people in our community outside of the university walls that are very
Absolutely.
meaningful. Yeah. So great. Well, thank you. Thank you again. Have a great rest of the day. And hopefully we'll see everybody back at future PJHR events.
Appreciate it.
Thanks.
Take care. Glad to be here.
Bye.